Good afternoon, everyone, and you're all most welcome to our final guest lecture of the 2023 Summer School series. It's good to have so many familiar faces back again. Good to see you all. I'm delighted today to introduce to you Ben Cassell. So Ben was, I have to say it, Ben was a student with me last year in a great class, and you got kittens, didn't you? You got kittens during the week, and the little kittens appeared in the
Did,
class.
yeah. I think it was the last couple of days we've got kittens. They are now cats.
They're not cats.
Yeah,
You know,
which
it was
I can
so
bring them on
exciting.
screen at the end if you want. I can go scoop one up.
Yes, please. Yes, personally, yes, please. Okay, frivolity aside. Okay, so Ben, we're delighted to have you here. Ben is a graduate of the Open University, big fan. I'm a graduate of the Open University too. And he's currently a PhD candidate at King's College in London. And his research focuses on how differing forms of Athenian collective memory were constructed via religious experience. And he is also a guest editor for the Journal of Cognitive Historiography and has published articles on Theseus and collective memory. So we're delighted to have you here today, Ben, and Ben is going to talk to us about another Herakles, Theseus in myth, cult, and Athenian identity. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you for the invitation for speaking with you all today. I was a student of yours. I will no doubt be a student of yours again. Greek always needs to be brushed up on. I'm going to try and share my screen now to make sure that can you see that?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, let me try and there we go. Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to talk about one of my all-time favorite subjects, which is Theseus. So I'll get underway. From the 7th century BC, the figure of Theseus underwent a drastic expansion in his popularity and importance to Athenian identity. Not only were new episodes and divine parentage attributed to the hero, but Theseus became the emblem of Athens as a political and cultural force, both at home and abroad. A key example of this is the way that Theseus was commemorated through various rituals, with older rites either being demonstrably reinterpreted or undergoing elaborate expansion. This afternoon, I set out to do two things. Initially, I want to give you an overview of the ways in which the figure and myths attached to Theseus evolved from something of a wild bandit to the democratic king we know from Euripides. I also want to underline how this evolution did not necessarily negate his earlier deeds, which were often seen in a negative light. Indeed, there were often critics of his rule as a king and even his foundation of proto-democracy. In the second part of this paper, I provide an introduction to some of the festivals and rituals in which Athenians commemorated and reenacted the hero's deeds. I will underline how Theseus, who actually had no real cult before the mid-6th century, came to be appropriated to various pre-existing rites, and in the case of Delos, was used as a means of legitimizing Athenian authority on the island. So in its early form, the myth of Theseus consisted of 5 main episodes: the abductions of Helen, Ariadne, an attempted abduction of Persephone, the battle with the centaurs, and most famously, that with the Minotaur. The earliest reference to these Thesean episodes appear in Homer. In the Iliad, Book 1, he is described as the son of the Athenian king Aegeus and belonging to the strongest generation of earthborn mortals. Later, in Book 3, there is also a veiled reference to his abduction of Helen, which resulted in Theseus's mother, Aethra, being kidnapped in turn by the twins Castor and Polydeices. While the Minotaur and Labyrinth are not explicitly mentioned, the Cretan adventure is alluded to in Book 11 of the Odyssey, where Ariadne is described as being killed by Artemis while Theseus was bringing her back to Athens. Book 11 also has our earliest reference to the failed abduction of Persephone and a subsequent imprisonment in Hades Theseus suffered as punishment. In visual depictions, the earliest of which survive from the 7th century, the focus is exclusively on the Cretan episode or the abduction of Helen. And we have a lovely example of the latter with the twins on the other side. I didn't have room to put them on. Here we have some lovely examples of how the slaying of the Minotaur was depicted across Greece in the 6th century BC. And actually we could see that while it evolved, it also remained fairly static. Hesiod describes Ariadne as being among the sexual partners of the hero, while also presenting the more familiar version of the story where she marries Dionysus rather than being killed by Artemis. Sappho certainly composed on the theme of the Cretan adventure in the late 7th or early 6th century BC, as did Simonides during the latter half of the 6th century. The Spartan poet Alcman, again in the 7th century, also mentions the episode of Helen's abduction by Theseus. The famous Francois vase, which dates from the early 6th century BC, provides our first Attic depiction of Thesean episodes, illustrating both the arrival of Theseus on Crete with the sacrificial youths and maidens, as well as battling alongside the Lapids against the centaurs. This vase also indicates its interaction with the description of the same episode in the Hesiodic Shield of Herakles, where the epithet Melagekai mirrors Melanchaites, shown here. Thus, by the 6th century BC, the Thesean episodes, most especially that of the Cretan adventure and the abduction of Helen, are firmly illustrated as being established within both epic and lyric compositions. This is also so in artistic representations, which come from across Greece. Up to this point, the episodes related to the hero are very specific and somewhat static, where he is entrenched in the Homeric register of monster slaying, rapine, and aiding one's friends. However, from the middle of the century, this was to change dramatically. Various new episodes came to be attributed to the hero, including new love affairs, the abduction of the Amazonian queen Antiope, and the victory over the Marathonian bull. A bronze statue of the Marathonian bull was likely erected on the Acropolis in the late 6th century, before it was destroyed or stolen during the Persian sack of 480 BC. A marble version later replaced it. In any case, after 510 BC, this episode and that of the Minotaur were visually organized into a brand new cycle of deeds that Theseus was said to have performed on the road from his birthplace in Troezen to Athens. This is a so-called Saronic Gulf cycle. Here, Theseus is depicted as a prototypical civilizer, rid in a landscape of barbarous boogeymen, the club-wielding Periphates, the pine-bending Cenas. He wrestled Cherikon the Arcadian to death at Eleusis, slew the Cremonian So, and killed Damastes by literally cutting him down to size so he could fit into his bed. In Megara, he also slew Scyron by throwing him from a cliff, something that he had apparently done to innocent passerby. However, Plutarch interestingly notes that Megarian writers often claim that this was slander, and in fact, Scyron was worshipped as a hero in Megaria in his own right. Another important development in the first decades of the 5th century was that Theseus was now described as being the son of Poseidon. This narrative is vividly portrayed in Bacchylides, the lyric poet of the 6th and 5th centuries BC, where the hero visits the home of his divine father while riding dolphins. This episode also decorated the Theseon in the Agora, which I'll turn to in a moment. The choice of Poseidon as Theseus's divine father naturally aligned with the image of the hero as a seafaring liberator of the Cyclades and the Aegean from the evil Thessalocronic power of Minos. Poseidon also became ever more popular himself after the Athenian victory at Salamis, and this is something that would only reinforce notions of his being the hero's father. While the abduction of the Amazonian queen, whether Antiope or Hippolyta, was known in the 6th century, the Amazonomachy, the invasion of the Amazonian army into Attica and the defense of the city by Theseus, was popularly depicted only in the classical era, including on the shield of Athena Parthenos, on the metopes of the Parthenon, and the western pediment of the temple of Athena Nike. It also decorated the hero's shrine and the famous painted stoa, both of which were in the agora. While the first literary reference, I think I should go back, well, the first literary reference comes in Aeschylus. Finally, Theseus came to be considered as having brought Athens into a single community and founded proto-democracy, which I will discuss in a moment. So we can see that from having been a relatively minor hero, Theseus underwent a very detectable transformation. He was now considered, as Plutarch describes it, as another Herakles, indeed their own Herakles. A good example of this is that Theseus drastically overtakes Herakles on Athenian ceramic art in this period, in fact going from only depicted on 5% of all vaseware to 24%. More striking still was the Athenian treasury at Delphi. Built somewhere between 510 and 480 BC, in celebration of the victory at Marathon, the treasury made a glaring comparison between Theseus and Herakles. The labours of both heroes were depicted on the metopes of the building, with obvious parallels being drawn. Perhaps more significantly, Athena was depicted as acting as the patron of Theseus and not Herakles. Here, in the Pan-Hellenic context of Delphi, Theseus acted as an emblem of Athenian power and prestige. He was an Athenian hero for Athenians. This was also the case in the work of the historian Herakles in his The Attica, which now only survives in fragmentary form. Not only does Theseus take on an Odyssean air of sneaky intelligence here, but the kidnap of Antiope is no longer conducted with Herakles, but rather with Phoebus, Theseus's charioteer. Now, theories as to what exactly prompted this surge in popularity have usually argued that it was due to the manipulations of one particular political figure or movement. Detailing these debates would far exceed the limits of this paper, but suffice to note that the tyranny of the Pisistratids, the democratic reforms of Cleisthenes, the general Cimon, or the buoyant Periclean period are all argued as being of differing importance by differing scholars. While it's certainly true that we can detect shifts in Thesean myth that align with exterior political changes, we cannot and should not ascribe his popularity to the promotion of one political figure alone. Indeed, the use of Theseus in any political machination itself points to a pre-existing popularity. Although political manipulation unquestionably played a part, the Athenian embrace of Theseus as a popular hero, national founder, and cult figure was so thorough and enthusiastic that it cannot be explained as the simple result of propaganda alone. For instance, the depiction of Scyron, who Theseus was now said to have thrown over a cliff, assuredly developed in conjunction with the claims both Megara and Athens made on the territories of Eleusis and Salamis. Yet this occurred across generations. The popularity of the Amazonarchy as a theme of civilization overcoming barbarism also related to the specific memory of the Persian sack of Athens in 490 BC, and was commemorated at various sites across the city. Another example is the return of Theseus's remains to Athens by the general Cimon. In 475 BC, the Athenians received an oracle commanding them to locate and return the remains of Theseus, who had died on Skyros, back to Athens. A little while after this, the general Cimon discovered the gigantic skeleton of the hero on the island and brought it back to Athens amid a great amount of pomp. The remains were installed in the Theseum, the shrine to the hero inside the agora, which, if not entirely new, was likely expanded at this time. This was itself decorated with images of the Amazonarchy, Theseus's journey under the ocean, and other episodes. The fulfillment of the oracle and the establishment of the physical presence of Theseus in Athens was greeted with mass celebration from the Athenian citizenry, who welcomed their favorite hero with processions and sacrifices. The Theseum now provided a centralized focus for the cult of Theseus inside Athens, even being assigned its own priests. Moreover, Cimon's return of these relics likely stimulated the celebration or expansion of the Greater Theseia, an annual festival that celebrated the hero and his exploits. The focus on Skyros is also firmly situated within the politico-military expansion of Athens under Cimon, who actually subdued the island. Indeed, the choice of Cimon to physically ensconce Theseus within Athens was conducted amidst a wider promotion of Athenocentrism and the city's calcification of power inside the Delian League in the mid-5th century. But Cimon was also the son of Miltiades, who had acted as general in the Battle of Marathon, and his convenient discovery of Theseus's remains can also be seen as a reaction to the widespread notion of Theseus as a divine defender of the Athenians. Indeed, Theseus was said to have fought at the Battle of Marathon, arising from the earth to aid the Athenians alongside the Olympian goddess Athena. Miltiades had been vital in obtaining the victory at Marathon, and so within the Thesean, we may see the subtle celebration of the general's own family and success. However, this was itself enacted in relation to the pre-existing popularity of Theseus. Now, an inherent result of Theseus' promotion to emblematic hero was that by the 5th century BC, he became fundamental to how Athenians conceived their shared past. Indeed, he became linked with the earthborn and primordial kings of Attica, Cecrops and Erechtheus. For Thucydides, the entire foundational age of Athens is bookended by the reigns of Cecrops and Theseus, with Erechtheus' reign set between the two. This organization is also evident in Xenophon, where Cecrops' judgment of the contest between Athena and Poseidon for Attica and the wars of Erechtheus and Theseus are mentioned in sequence. It has also been argued that Theseus was depicted alongside Cecrops and Erechtheus on the western pediment of the Parthenon, and with Cecrops on the temple of Athena Nike. We also have an aside from Pausanias, who notes that in the archaicizing form of the poets, Theseus is often referred to as an Erechthid. As well as being organized with the autochthonic kings from the foundational Athenian past, Theseus was visually assimilated with more recent events during the 5th century. This is demonstrated in the pose on the temple of Hephaestus, where he battles the centaurs on the top here. This distinct bodily position has been identified as deliberately mirroring that of the general Callimachus, who was depicted as fighting the Persians during the Battle of Marathon on the frieze of the temple of Athena Nike. Moreover, both these representations mimic the pose of Hermodius in the Tyrannosides statue group. However, the most significant development in how Athenians now perceive Theseus' importance to their own past was in his being attributed with uniting distinct towns into the single unit of Athens and founding proto-democracy. Euripides' Suppliant Women, first performed in 423 BC, is the first attestation to this tradition. Yet the argument that it was the playwright's invention is very difficult to establish. Importantly, Theseus here does not introduce a revolutionary change. He does not even abolish monarchy, but simply organizes the royal succession so the next monarch will be the people. In his Athenian constitution, Aristotle describes Theseus' reforms as only a slight divergence from the monarchy, but are chronologically positioned right before those of Draco, that is to say, having existed up until the recent past. We gain a similar picture from Pausanias, where he notes the common tradition that the democracy of Theseus lasted up until the dictatorship of the Pisistratids. Socrates says Theseus remains in our institutions. Indeed, the ambiguous manner in which Theseus's democracy is described points to the fact that Athenians had to negotiate this belief with the knowledge that monarchy existed after him. Yet as a benevolent king who now hands power to the people, Theseus of the Suppliant Women stands at the greatest possible divorce from the vision of the hero we met back in the 8th and 7th century. Yet if what I have presented so far suggests that Theseus was subject to some sort of uniformly agreed makeover, this was certainly not the case. Indeed, while the hero came to represent the self-image of Athens as a naval and cultural power, many aspects of his deeds were critiqued during the classical and later periods. His abduction of multiple women is the cause for criticism from multiple authors, not only for the act itself, but the trouble it brought on Athens. It has been argued that these episodes generally predate the invention of the Saronic Gulf cycle and were either repressed or altered to cast a more favorable light from the early 5th century. However, this was not universal, and where the orators and dramatists often promote a whitewashed nationalist image of Theseus, the local historians, the Athedographers, in fact underlined his hubristic violence against women. Plutarch notes that Theseus's dealings with women were neither honourable in their beginnings nor fortunate in their endings, and the abandonment of Ariadne was not even decent. Hellenikos also describes the extreme youth of Helen, while the Dioscuri invading Attica to rescue her, while the Dioscuri invade Attica to rescue her while he was again away attempting to rape Persephone. Similarly, his abduction at Antiope or Hippolyta again results in Athens being invaded by a foreign army, this time by the Amazons. During the constitutional debate in Herodotus, such mistreatment of women is described as an extension of the savage and unnatural violence carried out by kings, which is also the case in dealing death without trial, something evident in the exile and eventual death of Hippolytus. Indeed, while in the suppliant women he fiercely denies the existence of monarchy in Athens, Theseus specifically describes his rule as a tyranny in the Hippolytus. Our sources are completely unanimous in underlying Theseus's rape of the girl Helen as causing the invasion of the Dioscuri, while Plutarch describes Attica as filling with war. And by Herodotus, he endangered the whole Athenian territory. This finds a clear reverse with Aristotle's description of heroic kings extending their power to all things in the city. I may have skipped, no, that's the right side, to extend the power to all things in the city across country and border. In fact, the arrogance and violence of Theseus endangers the territorial integrity of Attica itself. The same passage from Herodotus points to another divergence from the model found in Aristotle. Hero kings, according to the philosopher, ruled over willing subjects. However, Theseus is presented as exercising his power over disgruntled and fearful citizens, and facing open contestation to his right to rule. It is due to the resentment of this heavy-handed nature that the Dioscuri are actually aided in recapturing Helen by the Athenians. In fact, it is the Dioscuri who are described as benefactors of all mankind. And while Theseus has brought on war through his own violence, importantly, the establishment of proto-democracy is also presented as an unwelcome imposition in some sources. Thucydides describes Theseus's synoikism as being accepted on the basis of both his argument and an awareness of his power. This picture is replicated in Plutarch, who has the reforms being accepted out of fear. Theophrastus's oligarchic man complains that Theseus is to blame for the introduction of demagoguery to Athens, while noting that he was in fact the first victim of democracy, that is to say, being ostracized. Indeed, while Plutarch's Theseus simply leaves Athens, Philochorus describes him as being expelled. So while Theseus came to be emblematic of Athenian self-confidence in the classical era, what these sources indicate is an ongoing negotiation with aspects of both his older and newer episodes that were deemed to be negative. So far, we have outlined the emergence of Theseus as a minor hero to national emblem between the 8th and 4th century BC. I now want to turn to how Theseus was commemorated and experienced in ritual. The importance of Plutarch's biography of the hero to this examination cannot be underestimated. The life of Theseus was likely composed towards the end of the author's life in AD 120, and so comparatively late to the periods under discussion here. However, as a work, the life of Theseus displays various levels of both typological and referential intertextuality, and his descriptions of the Thesean ritual must be considered in relation to this. Most prominently, it interacts within its moralized pairing with Romulus, where the foundational quality of both these figures are emphasized. A primary aspect of this is the dual characterization of them being religious founders. And while coming in a fairly compressed description in the life of Romulus, they are more sporadic in the Theseus. Yet in contrast to the Romulus, and indeed the other lives, the Theseus is indicated as being a product of specific research. Beginning the Theseus, Plutarch falsely indicates that he will purify mythic elements out of his narrative, and nevertheless admitting them under scrutiny. In this way, Plutarch frames his biography of Theseus outside of the style of the historical inquiry exemplified by Polybius, instead adopting a form of historiographic archaeologia of Diodorus Siculus and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, where he applies scrutiny to mythic elements, but their they're all the way through. It's here that the validity of Plutarch's life of Theseus as a source for commenting on the 5th and 4th centuries BC becomes apparent, as it included the direct citation of works and authors from those periods. Indeed, the Theseus shows very little interaction with the rest of Plutarch's corpus, but instead adopts an expressly intertextual quality by frequently referencing the works of 4th century local historians, the Athedographers. Not only does Plutarch employ these sources when describing the rituals under discussion here, but indeed adopts an antiquarian timbre himself and relies on his own observation and oral accounts extant in the 2nd century AD. Thus, as a source, the life of Theseus provides a valuable framework for analysing the Thesean ritual in the classical era. Now, one of the more glaring indicators that Theseus was once a very minor hero is the fact that he had almost no cultic presence in wider Attica, and even in Athens, it was very, very small, up until the mid-6th century BC. This very much perplexed Athenians of the classical era, with the local historian Philochorus providing an explanation that Theseus had in fact dedicated all the places where he received cult to his good friend Herakles. A shrine to the hero, the Theseum, likely came into existence at some point during the 6th century BC, yet was thought to have been built in the lifetime of the hero. It was here that Cimon would later install the remains of the hero. As a result of having no real established cult, yet being immensely popular, Theseus came to be either attached to or emphasized in pre-existing festivals or rituals. A testament to this is the fact that the 8th day of every month of the Athenian year was now sacred to both him and Poseidon. And here is a brief summary of how and where Theseus appeared in the Athenian religious calendar. We don't know whether in the bottom left, the Herakles took part, but that was probably a fairly big event in and of itself. And on all, I tried to fit them in, but it was it was even more wordy than this. List of the differing types of sacrifices to characters from sort of the Thesean orbits that took part during these festivals. But yeah, this is a brief summation. So the first ritual that I want to discuss is the Oskophora, which was celebrated on the 7th of Paenopsion, that is our October or November. It consisted of a procession from a shrine of Dionysus inside Athens to that of Athena Sciras at the port of Phaleron, where feasting and games took place. As well as Plutarch, this framework is also attested in a famous 4th century BC stele, where the important roles of the Oskophori and the Deipnophoroi are listed as being picked from the genus Salaminoi. Now, the Oskophoria is agreed to have originally been an overtly Dionysian affair that relied on the autumn vintage up until the start of the 6th century BC. However, after this, it began to take on an increasingly Thesean air. In fact, he came to be its recognized founder and commemorated the Cretan adventure. In describing the Oskophoria, Plutarch openly states his use of the Athedographer Damon's history, which indicates the focus on Theseus existing in the classical period. Plutarch also openly refers to oral tradition when building his construction of this festival. So a notable feature of the procession here to the port of Phaleron was its being led by 2 young men called the Oskophoroi, as recorded on the 4th century BC stele. These Oskophoroi wore female dress and carried vine branches. Both of these features have been cited as a glaring example of the Dionysian flavour of the Oskophoria, yet in Plutarch, they are only ever related to the Cretan expedition. In fact, it now represented a replication of Theseus's disguising 2 youths as maidens before going to Crete, and heading a procession on his return with them still in this dress. The carrying of vine branches also mimicked Theseus, who had done so in honour of the union of Ariadne and Dionysus. Plutarch also notes that this may have been done simply because Theseus returned at the time of the vintage. Plutarch relates how Theseus sought the original youths to imitate maidens in their speech, dress, and gait, suggesting that as well as in outfit, the Oskophori may have also adopted a stylized form of movement to appear more feminine. But the Oskophori were not the only ones to reperform events from the episodes of Theseus's departure and return from Crete. Upon arriving at the shrine of Athena Sciras at the port of Phaleron, and during the pouring of libations, the crown performed a distinctive cry of the Elu, Ioi, Ioi. This deliberately reenacted the cries of joy at Theseus's return and those of sorrow at the death of King Aegeus, who had leapt from the Acropolis thinking his son dead. As such, the wider procession likewise imitated aspects of the original events of Theseus's Cretan adventure. This process is also evident in the designated roles of the Phoroi, the female meal bearers, who carried the foodstuffs within the procession to Phaleron, and are described as sharing in the sacrifice at the shrine of Athena. Theseus himself received a pig during this sacrifice. Plutarch's description of this role is again derived from Damon, and a Thesean etiology is also attested in another athedographer, Herakles. This select group of women are described as deliberately imitating the mothers of the youths and maidens that went to Crete. This was emphasized in these mothers telling stories at the festival, which was again seen as a repetition of the Thesean episode. The Oschophoria thus operated as a commemoration of particular points in Theseus's Cretan adventure through the direct reenactment of specific characters and events. What's more, we're able to detect how, where the festival had originally been one focused on Dionysus, its appropriative inclusion of the hero manifested at a point where his popularity was escalating. The day immediately following the Oschophoria, Athenians celebrated the Pionopsia, which again commemorated Theseus's Cretan adventure. These rituals again indicate themselves as having previously been related to a single Olympian god, in this case, Apollo, not least due to it being performed on the 7th day of the month, which was sacred to the god. In any case, Plutarch accounts for this Apolline quality in that after burying Aegeus, Theseus gave thanks to Apollo for having returned safely from Crete. In fact, as a god concerned with the political life and maturation of youths into adult citizens, Theseus, as the quintessential ephebos or young man and citizen, is repeatedly tied to Apollo in Athenian tradition. A key aspect of this festival was a communal feast of boiled beans, which emerged as a custom from the meal Theseus had eaten before landing back in Attica. A branch of olive wood was covered with wool and fruits and also carried by young men that again belied an Apolline origin and Thesean interpretation for those rites. In fact, it mimicked the branch Theseus used at the time of his supplication to Apollo. And the carrying of these branches was also accompanied by a song. Eroson, bring us figs and bread of the richest quality. Bring us honey and pots of oil to rub off from the body. Strong wine too in a beaker, that we may go to bed mellow. These aspects of the ritual really suggest that the festival was originally dedicated to Apollo, where the fruits of the harvest accompany a meal of unremarkable ingredients, signaling the transition into a period of fragility into abundance. Thus, during the Pionopsia, the worship of Apollo was conducted through a commemoration of Theseus's original supplication to the god before sailing to Crete and his victorious return. If we follow Robert Parker's argument that these branches were deposited in the temple of Apollo Delphinos, then the Pionopsia also included an architectural space which was very much associated with the hero. In fact, this temple was associated with the arrival of Theseus to Athens from Troezen, including the display of the place where Medea had tried to poison him. As with the Oschophoria, we can see that a single festival could commemorate differing points in Theseus' story, here being his entry into Athens, leaving for Crete, and his triumphant return. Another festival said to have been founded by Theseus was that of the Kybernesia, which was celebrated on the 8th of Boedromion, September-October. The port of Phaleron was once again the focus of this ritual, while its Aetion, as a sea pilot's festival, illustrates its nautical tone. Plutarch's brief description of this rite is done so in express reference to the athedographer Herakles, stating that Theseus received his lookout man and pilot for the voyage to Crete from the king of the island of Salamis, Skyros. These sailormen, namely Nausithous and Phaeax, were directly commemorated during the Kybernesia, and the 4th century BC stele noted above likewise mentions how these heroes received sacrifice alongside Poseidon. As well as employing Herakles, Plutarch notes how this episode is evidenced in the landscape by their tombs, which Theseus built at Phaleron near the temple of Sciras, and which provided the physical focal point of this rite. What's particularly fascinating about this festival is that the names of these heroes have been argued as indicating its pre-Thesean form. Indeed, they are reflective of the sailors par excellence of the heroic age, the Phaeacians, as presented in Homer. Within the figure of Nausithous, we may also have a familial connection with the divine focus of the rite, Poseidon Hippodromos, if he is indeed that named by Homer as the son of the god. It's perhaps unwise to say that Theseus had no role in an older version of the Kybernesia. However, his overt importance in the descriptions of the Athedographers does suggest a later manipulation of established traditions. If Nausithous was celebrated as the son of Poseidon during this festival, it would surely be Theseus that came to be emphasized in this role during the classical period. The inclusion of Theseus into a festival structure that honored particular heroes and Poseidon is certainly in keeping with his escalating popularity from the mid-5th century BC, and the Kybernesia illustrates this. As well as the tombs of the heroes, the port of Phaleron contained various relics to the Cretan adventure. Androgeus, son of Minos, also had an altar here, and this is where the Thesean ship was likely docked. More on this in a moment. The temple of Athena Sciras also contained altars to the children of Theseus, and the eponymous Phileros was said to have colonized Cyprus with Theseus' son Camus after leaving Phaleron. The Kybernesia thus provides us with a great example of how Athenians came to place selected emphasis on established rituals and their material context in order to commemorate Theseus. Indeed, he became recognized as their founder. So far, we have seen that the commemoration of Theseus in ritual context manifested through imitation, physical materials such as tombs, and appropriative emphasis. These processes are very clear in the annual Theoria, a sacred delegation, to Delos, which marked the hero's landing on the island when sailing back from Crete. Plutarch describes the etiology of this delegation as originating when Theseus returned from Crete, put into Delos and sacrificed to Apollo, while also dedicating a statue of Aphrodite Ariadne had given him in his temple. It was here that he led the youths and maidens that he had saved from the Minotaur in a dance that mimicked the winding passages of the labyrinth. This was the famous Goranos dance. This episode was certainly prevalent during the 5th century BC at least, as evidenced by Herakles, who notes that the Theoria sent by Athens was also initiated by Theseus in honor of Apollo and Artemis. Indeed, this entire delegation is indicated as overtly reenactive. It employed the same ship Theseus was said to have used during the Cretan expedition, while those that made up the performing choir are described in the same terms as the twice 7 youths and maidens. The name used by Aristotle to describe this choir is Theseus, an archaicizing term for youths, which is likewise used by Bacchylides in specific reference to those that made up the Cretan expedition. As Theseus had done, the dance was also performed around the famous Keraton altar, which was made of the horns of animals hunted by Apollo, as had Theseus. While this altar had stood uncovered during the Archaic period, it became housed within an apsidal building during the 5th century BC, as directed by the Athenians. Callimachus, writing in the 3rd century BC, also demonstrates that the statue of Aphrodite was also decorated with flowers and wreaths during this rite. As such, the delegation to Delos and the Goranos dance afforded an immersive experience of Theseus's Cretan adventure. While sailing in the ship, participants were literally framed by material evidence of Theseus. What is important to underline is that while the Goranos dance is described as being performed by a local choir of Delian maidens in later centuries, it was an Athenian choir that did so during the classical period and at the height of the Delian League. While this specialized female choir is evident in periods of Delian independence, it was only a phoeboi that are listed in the epigraphic record from when Athens had control of the island. Indeed, this delegation and the Goranos dance would have operated in tandem with other ways Athens either highlighted or inserted itself into Delos's past. While I will not present an exhaustive list here, various heroes, monuments, and episodes that promoted an image of Athenian involvement on Delos were emphasized during this period from the mid-5th century BC. Indeed, for Athenian members of the audience and the performing choir, the Granos dance would have provided an evocation of Theseus that would have aided in legitimizing the overt control Athens wielded on Delos during this period. The experience of this ritual dance would assuredly have been different to local Delians. Not only were they very likely limited in how they could actually see it, owing to the new building the altar was housed in, the celebration of an Athenian hero through Athenian means would have aided in abstracting them from their island's past. A very clear example that this delegation and the memory of Theseus have become associated with the Athenian control on Delos is that the famous Thesean ship was finally retired after the establishment of Delian independence in 314 BC. So, some conclusions. The figure of Theseus provides one of the most glaring examples that myth in the ancient world, rather than being continuously static, could evolve, shift, and in fact expand in relation to different contexts. From being a minor hero in the 8th to 7th centuries BC, Theseus catapulted to the front and center of Athenian self-consciousness. He became an emblem of Athens' bullish self-confidence, both at home and abroad. From being associated only with the Cretan adventure, battling centaurs and conducting various abductions, he was now the divine defender of Athens during both the Amazonomachy and at Marathon. After the early 5th century, the Saronic gold cycle also mirrored the labors of Herakles, while proving Theseus to be a civilizing hero in his own right. Moreover, he gained divine parentage in the form of Poseidon. Finally, as a ruler now associated with the earthborn kings Cecrops and Erechtheus, he became recognized as having founded proto-democracy. Indeed, we have only been able to touch on a portion of the new and old episodes that became associated with Theseus at this time. As we have seen, this dramatic evolution had to negotiate the hero's earlier episodes, and especially in his treatment of women and the disaster this brought onto Athens, of which many of the authors were openly critical. In terms of cultic presence, in the Athenian religious calendar, this dramatic rise in popularity meant that Theseus became attached or selectively emphasized to pre-existing rituals and festivals. Festivals such as the Oskophoria strongly underlined its Thesean connections. The Thesean centralized his cult on a state-wide level, while in the context of the 5th century, the Granos dance can be seen as a mechanism for retrojecting the contemporary control Athenian had on Delos back into the heroic era. What I've also attempted to underline is how, through mimicking the actions of differing characters, using material objects and relics, and through interacting with the landscape and spaces in which particular episodes took place, these rites afforded an experience and not just commemoration of Thesean myth. Indeed, these experiences would have been a vital means by which Athenians would come to identify with the hero, and indeed come to view him as another Herakles. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben. It's fabulous.